Crestwood was a city drowning in corruption. The police department, the courts, even the mayor's office. Every institution meant to uphold justice had been twisted into a machine that protected the powerful and crushed the innocent. For years, officers like Captain Frank Marston and his team ruled the streets, not with law and order, but with fear and greed. And the man who allowed it all to happen? Judge Harold Whitaker. Then came Evelyn Carter, a prosecutor with one mission: to bring them down. At first, they laughed at her. They thought they were untouchable. Even when evidence piled up, the trial was just a formality, a show put on for the public before Whitaker ruled in their favor, like he always did. But then, Evelyn did something no one expected. She revealed that she wasn't just a prosecutor. She had been appointed as the new U.S. attorney for the district. With federal power behind her, she tore their carefully crafted lies apart, exposing the depths of their crimes. Marston, Reese, O'Connor, Mallory, Whitaker, one by one, they fell. But Crestwood's corruption ran deeper than anyone realized. As Evelyn fought to dismantle the system, she uncovered something far worse: a conspiracy reaching all the way to the mayor himself. And when powerful men like Mayor Calloway start to feel the walls closing in, they don't just fight back. They try to eliminate the problem. Now, Evelyn isn't just fighting for justice. She's fighting to stay alive. Who can she trust? How far does the conspiracy go? And when the most dangerous people in the city are coming for her, will she be able to finish what she started? Stay with us as we unravel the full story. A tale of power, deception, and one woman's relentless pursuit of justice. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a single twist. And let me know, where you watching from? The grand courthouse of Crestwood loomed over the city square, its marble pillars casting long shadows under the morning sun. It was an ancient structure, one that had seen generations of justice, both fair and corrupt. Today, it would witness something unprecedented. Inside, the courtroom was filled to capacity. Spectators murmured in hushed voices, their eyes flickering between the judge's bench and the defendant's table. At the prosecution's side sat 4 uniformed police officers, men who had, for years, worn their badges like shields of untouchable power. Captain Frank Marston, Lieutenant Darren Reese, Sergeant Brian O'Connor, and Officer Heather Mallory. They were the golden boys of the Crestwood Police Department, celebrated for their high arrest numbers and their supposed war on crime. Yet today, they were not the ones presenting a case. They were the ones on trial. But they had nothing to fear. Judge Harold Whitaker sat atop his bench, his gavel resting lightly in his wrinkled hand. His thinning white hair glowed under the courtroom lights, his eyes sharp behind gold-rimmed glasses. He was the kind of man who prided himself on order, not necessarily on justice. Over the years, his courtroom had become a revolving door for criminals who knew the right people. And these officers? They knew the right people. When the case had first been filed, accusing Marston and his team of widespread corruption, it had seemed like a joke. But as weeks passed, the case grew teeth. Witnesses stepped forward, citizens who had been threatened, evidence that had been altered, criminals who had been allowed to walk free in exchange for loyalty. Then, the real problem had arrived in the form of a woman. She sat at the prosecutor's table now, poised and silent, watching. No one in the room knew much about her. Only her name, Evelyn Carter. She had arrived in Crestwood 3 weeks ago, walking into the district attorney's office without fanfare, carrying a sealed file labeled federal jurisdiction. She had not come to play. Evelyn Carter was a tall, commanding presence. Her dark brown skin seemed to contrast against the sharp gray suit she wore, her hair pulled back into a tight bun. There was a calm, quiet power in her movements, in the way she sat with perfect posture, her fingers lightly tapping against the stack of files before her. She had barely spoken since the trial began, letting the evidence speak for itself. But today, everything would change. Judge Whitaker cleared his throat. Let's move forward. The court has reviewed the arguments, and after careful consideration, I have reached a decision. The murmurs in the room fell silent. The officers at the defense table relaxed slightly. They already knew what was coming. Whitaker adjusted his glasses, scanning the crowd before speaking. The allegations against these officers are unsubstantiated. There is no sufficient proof of misconduct that meets the standard of conviction. Therefore, this court finds Captain Frank Marston, Lieutenant Darren Reese, Sergeant Brian O'Connor, and Officer Heather Mallory. He paused for effect, then gave them a reassuring smile. Not guilty. The words slammed into the courtroom like a wrecking ball. A moment of stunned silence, then a roar of reactions. The officers smirked, shaking hands with their lawyers. Supporters of the police clapped, their cheers breaking through the courtroom walls. But on the other side of the room, outrage erupted. People shouted in protest. Victims who had testified against them looked betrayed, their voices rising in anger. Yet, through it all, Evelyn Carter did not move. She remained seated, her expression unreadable. Then slowly she stood. She placed her hands on the table and exhaled, as if centering herself. Then she spoke, her voice cool and clear. "Your Honor, I object." The room fell into a stunned hush. Judge Whitaker's head snapped toward her. "Miss Carter, this is not a debate. The ruling is final." Evelyn tilted her head, studying him. Then she reached in her bag and pulled out a slim, black leather folder. She flipped it open and extracted a document. "With all due respect, Your Honor, it is not final. As of this morning, under the authority granted to me by the United States Department of Justice, I am no longer just a special prosecutor on this case." She turned the document so that the judge and everyone else could see the official government seal stamped at the top. "I have been appointed as the new United States Attorney for this district. Effective immediately, I am reopening the investigation at a federal level." Gasps echoed across the room. Marston's smirk vanished. Reese's fingers tightened around the armrest of his chair. Even Judge Whitaker sat back, his expression unreadable. Evelyn Carter looked at them all. Then she smiled, but it was not a friendly smile. "And now, gentlemen," she said, her voice laced with quiet fire, "the real trial begins." The grand courthouse of Crestwood loomed over the city square, its marble pillars casting long shadows under the morning sun. It was an ancient structure, one that had seen generations of justice, both fair and corrupt. Today it would witness something unprecedented. Inside, the courtroom was filled to capacity. Spectators murmured in hushed voices, their eyes flickering between the judge's bench and the defendant's table. At the prosecution side sat 4 uniformed police officers, men who had, for years, worn their badges like shields of untouchable power. Captain Frank Marston, Lieutenant Darren Reese, Sergeant Brian O'Connor, and Officer Heather Mallory. They were the golden boys of the Crestwood Police Department, celebrated for their high arrest numbers and their supposed war on crime. Yet today, they were not the ones presenting a case. They were the ones on trial. But they had nothing to fear. Judge Harold Whitaker sat atop his bench, his gavel resting lightly in his wrinkled hand. His thinning white hair glowed under the courtroom lights, his eyes sharp behind gold-rimmed glasses. He was the kind of man who prided himself on order, not necessarily on justice. Over the years, his courtroom had become a revolving door for criminals who knew the right people. And these officers? They knew the right people. When the case had first been filed, accusing Marston and his team of widespread corruption, it had seemed like a joke. But as weeks passed, the case grew teeth. Witnesses stepped forward, citizens who had been threatened, evidence that had been altered, criminals who had been allowed to walk free in exchange for loyalty. Then, the real problem had arrived in the form of a woman. She sat at the prosecutor's table now, poised and silent, watching. No one in the room knew much about her. Only her name, Evelyn Carter. She had arrived in Crestwood 3 weeks ago, walking into the district attorney's office without fanfare, carrying a sealed file labeled federal jurisdiction. She had not come to play. Evelyn Carter was a tall, commanding presence. Her dark brown skin seemed to contrast against the sharp gray suit she wore, her hair pulled back into a tight bun. There was a calm, quiet power in her movements, in the way she sat with perfect posture, her fingers lightly tapping against the stack of files before her. She had barely spoken since the trial began, letting the evidence speak for itself. But today, everything would change. Judge Whitaker cleared his throat. Let's move forward. The court has reviewed the arguments, and after careful consideration, I have reached a decision. The murmurs in the room fell silent. The officers at the defense table relaxed slightly. They already knew what was coming. Whitaker adjusted his glasses, scanning the crowd before speaking. The allegations against these officers are unsubstantiated. There is no sufficient proof of misconduct that meets the standard of conviction. Therefore, this court finds Captain Frank Marston, Lieutenant Darren Reese, Sergeant Brian O'Connor, and Officer Heather Mallory. He paused for effect, then gave them a reassuring smile. Not guilty. The words slammed into the courtroom like a wrecking ball. A moment of stunned silence, then a roar of reactions. The officers smirked, shaking hands with their lawyers. Supporters of the police clapped, their cheers breaking through the courtroom walls. But on the other side of the room, outrage erupted. People shouted in protest. Victims who had testified against them looked betrayed, their voices rising in anger. Yet, through it all, Evelyn Carter did not move. She remained seated, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly she stood. She placed her hands on the table and exhaled, as if centering herself. Then she spoke, her voice cool and clear. Your Honor, I object. The room fell into a stunned hush. Judge Whitaker's head snapped toward her. Miss Carter, this is not a debate. The ruling is final. Evelyn tilted her head, studying him. Then she reached in her bag and pulled out a slim, black leather folder. She flipped it open and extracted a document. With all due respect, Your Honor, it is not final. As of this morning, under the authority granted to me by the United States Department of Justice, I am no longer just a special prosecutor on this case. She turned the document so that the judge and everyone else could see the official government seal stamped at the top. I have been appointed as the new United States Attorney for this district. Effective immediately, I am reopening the investigation at a federal level. Gasps echoed across the room. Marston's smirk vanished. Reese's fingers tightened around the armrest of his chair. Even Judge Whitaker sat back, his expression unreadable. Evelyn Carter looked at them all. Then she smiled, but it was not a friendly smile. And now, gentlemen, she said, her voice laced with quiet fire, the real trial begins. The courtroom remained frozen in stunned silence. The weight of Evelyn Carter's words had settled over the space like a dense fog, suffocating and inescapable. Captain Frank Marston was the first to break. He leaned forward, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edge of the table. His voice, once filled with arrogance, now carried an undeniable edge of desperation. This is outrageous, he growled, his blue eyes flashing with fury. You can't just override the judge's ruling. That's not how the system works. Evelyn turned her gaze to him, unbothered. No, Captain, that's not how your system works. But I don't play by your rules. Judge Whitaker cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses in an attempt to maintain control. But the beads of sweat forming at his temple betrayed his unease. Miss Carter, he began, his voice straining for authority. You may have federal backing, but this court has already made its ruling. There is no case left to prosecute. Evelyn let out a slow breath, then picked up the black folder she had placed on the table. She flipped through the papers before selecting a single sheet. Your Honor, she said, stepping toward the bench, this is a federal indictment. It names Captain Frank Marston, Lieutenant Darren Reese, Sergeant Brian O'Connor, and Officer Heather Mallory as the heads of a widespread corruption ring operating within the Crestwood Police Department. She placed the paper on the judge's bench, right in front of him, and it has already been signed by a grand jury. The courtroom gasped again, but this time the reaction was different. This was not just a dramatic turn in a trial. It was a coup. The judge's authority had been cut out from under him, and everyone knew it. Whitaker stared at the document, his fingers twitching at his sides. Evelyn tilted her head slightly. I understand this may come as a surprise, Your Honor, but you should know the FBI has been conducting a parallel investigation into this case. We have obtained new evidence, including financial records, witness statements, and surveillance footage that was mysteriously omitted from the original trial. Across the room, Marston's face darkened. "You're bluffing." Evelyn turned toward him, her expression blank. "Am I?" She reached into her folder again and this time pulled out a USB drive. "This," she said, holding it between her fingers, "contains an audio recording of a conversation that took place 2 weeks ago in the back room of O'Connor's bar. It includes a discussion about bribes, altered evidence, and direct threats against witnesses. Voices on the recording include yourself, Captain Marston, and you, Lieutenant Reese." Reese's face went sheet white. "This is a setup," he hissed. "You planted that." Evelyn smiled coolly. "If that were the case, I suppose our forensic analysts at the FBI laboratory must also be in on the conspiracy, because they confirmed, beyond any doubt, that the voices on this recording are yours." O'Connor, usually the quietest of the four, slammed his fist against the table. "We have lawyers. You can't just railroad us like this. We'll fight this in federal court." Evelyn set the USB drive down. "Oh, I hope you do, because unlike this courtroom, federal trials don't get conveniently lost in bureaucracy." Mallory, the only woman among the accused, exhaled sharply. Her hands trembled slightly as she ran them through her auburn hair. Unlike the others, she had always been the one to clean up their messes, to make things disappear. But this? There was no making this disappear. Judge Whitaker straightened, finding his voice. "Miss Carter, I am warning you." Evelyn turned to face him sharply. "No, I am warning you, Your Honor." She stepped closer, lowering her voice so that only he could hear. The moment the handcuffs locked around Captain Marston's wrists, the entire courtroom seemed to tilt. The once mighty officer, the man who had commanded fear and loyalty in equal measure, now stood helpless in the firm grip of federal agents. His face twisted in rage as he struggled against them, but the metal around his wrists told him the truth. His power was gone. The other officers fared no better. Lieutenant Reese cursed under his breath. His jaw clenched so tight a vein bulged at his temple. Sergeant O'Connor, usually the mastermind behind their schemes, stared blankly at the floor, as if trying to comprehend how everything had unraveled so quickly. And Officer Mallory? Her hands trembled slightly, her breath coming in sharp gasps. Evelyn Carter stood motionless, watching the entire scene unfold with calm precision. Judge Whitaker had yet to speak. His hands gripped the edge of his bench, his knuckles pale against the polished wood. His reputation, his power, his very survival hinged on what happened next. His voice, when it finally came, was hoarse. This is highly irregular." Evelyn turned to face him, her dark eyes unwavering. "Irregular?" She let out a humorless laugh. "What's irregular, Your Honor, is allowing a trial to proceed when the judge has been compromised." The room inhaled collectively. Marston snapped his head up. "What the hell are you talking about?" Evelyn reached into her folder once more, pulling out another set of documents. She walked up the steps toward the judge's bench, placing them down carefully in front of him. "These are copies of financial transactions linked directly to you, Judge Whitaker. Payments made through offshore accounts, all tied to a shell company that, surprise, surprise, just so happens to have been registered by an associate of Captain Marston." Whitaker's breath hitched. He reached for the papers, his fingers trembling slightly as he skimmed the pages. Evelyn's voice was calm, but it sliced through him like a blade. "Tell me, Your Honor, how does a government salary afford a second home in the Hamptons, or a luxury car collection, or $500,000 deposited over the past 5 years into accounts you swore under oath you didn't own?" A murmur of shock rippled through the courtroom. The spectators leaned forward, hanging on to every word. Whitaker's mouth opened, but no sound came out. "You've been protecting them," Evelyn continued, stepping back so the entire courtroom could see him. "Covering their tracks, ensuring they were never convicted, bending the law in their favor." She tilted her head slightly, studying him. "Tell me, Judge Whitaker, when exactly did you stop serving the people and start serving criminals?" Whitaker slammed his hand against the bench. "Enough of this nonsense." His voice cracked under the strain, his composure slipping. "I will not be spoken to like this in my own courtroom." Evelyn smiled, a small, knowing smile. That's where you're mistaken, Your Honor. This is no longer your courtroom. The double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open once more. More agents entered, moving with quiet efficiency. Unlike before, these men were not in tactical gear. They wore dark suits, their presence exuding something even more dangerous than force: authority. One of them, a tall man with a crisp navy blue tie, stepped forward and addressed the judge directly. Judge Harold Whitaker, under the authority of the United States Department of Justice, you are hereby placed under federal investigation for obstruction of justice, bribery, and conspiracy. The silence in the room was deafening. Whitaker's face drained of color. You can't do this." Evelyn turned toward him once more, her voice gentle but laced with steel. "Actually, we can." She gestured toward the back of the room. "You should know by now, Judge, that the law applies to everyone, even you." The man in the navy blue tie nodded to the agents, and they stepped forward. For the first time in his decades on the bench, Whitaker looked genuinely afraid. "This is a mistake," he stammered, stepping back. "I can explain." "You'll have the opportunity to do so," Evelyn interrupted. In federal court, the sound of metal clicking shut echoed through the room as they placed him in handcuffs. Whitaker let out a strangled noise of disbelief, his mind spinning, searching for a way out. But there was none. The very system he had manipulated for years had finally turned against him. The gallery erupted. People cheered, clapping, some even wiping tears from their eyes. For too long, justice had felt like an illusion in Crestwood. But today it was real. Marston, still restrained, turned his burning glare toward Evelyn. "You think this is over? You think you've won?" Evelyn met his gaze head-on. "Oh, Captain," she said softly, "this isn't the end. This is just the beginning." The agents escorted the disgraced judge and officers out of the courtroom. Their once proud uniforms and robes now nothing more than symbols of the corruption they had built. As the doors shut behind them, Evelyn exhaled, allowing herself a brief moment to absorb what had just happened. Then she turned back to the gallery, the people who had suffered under these men, who had lost faith in the system. She stepped forward and spoke, not with legal jargon, not with intimidation, but with something more powerful. "To those who have waited for justice, this is for you. And I promise it doesn't stop here." A standing ovation erupted, and as she stood in that courtroom, Evelyn Carter knew one thing for certain. Crestwood would never be the same again. The news spread like wildfire. By nightfall, every television station, every online news outlet, and every social media platform was flooded with headlines. Federal corruption scandal shocks Crestwood. Judge and officers arrested. U.S. Attorney Evelyn Carter exposes deep-rooted conspiracy. Justice served in historic courtroom showdown. The city of Crestwood had been holding its breath for years, trapped under the weight of a justice system rigged against them. But now, for the first time in decades, the people felt something different: relief. But for Evelyn Carter, there was no time to celebrate. Inside the dimly lit precinct, tension crackled through the air like an electrical storm. Officers gathered in small clusters, their whispers laced with uncertainty and fear. The walls, once adorned with framed photos of Marston and his team, now seemed to close in on them. Chief Randall Pfeiffer, a thick-necked man with graying hair, stood in his office, his jaw tight as he watched the news play out on the small television mounted to the wall. The footage was damning. Marston and his officers being dragged away in cuffs. Judge Whitaker looking pale and broken. Pfeiffer slammed his fist onto his desk. The department was imploding, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. A sharp knock at his door made him turn. A junior officer, barely out of the academy, hesitated before stepping inside. "Sir, there's someone here to see you." Pfeiffer exhaled through his nose. "Tell them I'm busy." The officer swallowed. "It's U.S. Attorney Carter, sir." Silence. Pfeiffer felt his chest tighten. "She's here already?" Evelyn Carter sat calmly at the table, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Across from her, Chief Pfeiffer entered the room with slow, measured steps, his uniform crisp but his expression anything but composed. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice like gravel. "I wasn't expecting you." Evelyn didn't smile. "You should have been." She gestured to the empty chair across from her. "Have a seat, Chief." Pfeiffer hesitated before sinking into the chair. His gaze was unreadable, but Evelyn had dealt with men like him before. He was calculating his next move, weighing his options. "You came here to gloat?" he asked, forcing a smirk. Evelyn leaned forward slightly. "I came here to make something clear. The arrest today, that was just the beginning. Marston and his people weren't working alone, and I have reason to believe this department is still crawling with corruption." Pfeiffer's eyes darkened. "You have no idea how things work in this city." Evelyn tilted her head slightly. "No? Then why don't you explain it to me?" Silence stretched between them. Pfeiffer's fingers tapped against the table, his mind racing. "What do you want?" Evelyn didn't blink. "Full cooperation. I want access to every case file Marston and his team handled. I want to know who else was involved, who's been covering for them, and how deep this goes." Pfeiffer let out a short laugh. "You think I'm just going to hand over my department to you?" Evelyn reached in her bag and pulled out a thick envelope. She slid it across the table. "These are subpoenas. And this." She tapped the second document inside. "This is a formal request for federal oversight of your department. Which means, Chief, whether you cooperate or not, I'm getting in." Pfeiffer's smirk faltered. He knew what this meant. The federal government wasn't just coming for the bad cops. They were coming for all of them. For years, he had played the game, looking the other way when necessary, letting Marston and his people run their operations as long as they kept the department looking clean on the surface. Now, there was no hiding. "You have until tomorrow morning to start handing over records," Evelyn said, rising to her feet, "or I'll be back with a warrant." Pfeiffer didn't respond as she walked out of the room. The walls were closing in, and for the first time in his career, he had no control over what happened next. Pfeiffer sat alone in his office, his mind a whirlwind of calculations. He needed to figure out his next move. A knock at the door made him tense. "Come in." The door opened slowly, and a man in a dark suit stepped inside. He moved with confidence, like someone who wasn't used to being questioned. His face was hard, his smile practiced. Pfeiffer's stomach twisted. He knew this man. "What the hell are you doing here?" Pfeiffer asked, his voice low. The man shut the door behind him, his expression unreadable. "Damage control," he said simply. Pfeiffer exhaled, rubbing his temple. "You don't understand. She's not like the others. Carter is digging deep. If we don't..." The man raised a hand, cutting him off. "We always knew this was a possibility. We planned for it." Pfeiffer narrowed his eyes. "Planned for what?" The man took a step closer. "For the moment when we'd have to clean up." Pfeiffer's blood ran cold. "You're talking about Carter." The man didn't answer. He didn't have to. The implication was clear. Evelyn Carter had made herself a target. Pfeiffer shook his head. "No, no, you don't touch her. That would make things worse." The man's expression remained neutral. "That's not your decision to make." Pfeiffer clenched his fists, his breath coming in short gasps. He had been part of this game for years, but this was different. This wasn't just about covering tracks. This was a war. The man in the suit turned toward the door. "Stay out of the way, Chief. We'll handle it." Then he was gone. Pfeiffer sat there, the weight of what had just been said pressing down on him like a vice. For the first time since this all started, he wasn't afraid of the federal government. He was afraid of the people he worked for. And if he was afraid, then Evelyn Carter had no idea what kind of danger she was really in. The streets of Crestwood were unusually quiet as Evelyn Carter drove through the dimly lit avenues toward her temporary office. She had spent the evening at the courthouse, reviewing files, preparing for the next phase of her case. But something in the air felt different. The weight of what she had done was sinking in. She had shattered the foundation of corruption that had been cemented in Crestwood for decades. But no victory came without consequences. As she turned onto a deserted side street, her phone buzzed beside her. She glanced at the screen. Unknown number. Evelyn sighed and answered. "Carter." There was a pause before a distorted voice came through. "You should leave town." Her grip on the wheel tightened. "Who is this?" "You don't need to know, but if you're smart, you'll take the hint." The call ended. Evelyn slowed the car. pulling over beneath a flickering streetlight. She took a deep breath, her mind racing. It was starting. Threats were expected. But this wasn't just a warning. It was a promise. She was being hunted. Evelyn wasn't the type to scare easily. But she wasn't reckless either. Instead of going home, she drove straight to a secure location, an apartment rented under an alias, set up weeks in advance for exactly this kind of situation. She parked in the underground garage, her eyes scanning for anything out of place. A shadow moving where it shouldn't. A car that didn't belong. Nothing. Still, the feeling didn't leave her. She took the elevator up to the 8th floor, entered her code, and stepped inside the apartment. The space was simple, minimal furniture, no personal belongings. Just a desk, a laptop, and a gun within reach. She locked the door behind her, set down her bag, and powered up her computer. Her fingers moved quickly, pulling up surveillance footage from outside her real apartment, an extra precaution she had taken early on. She rewound through the last 2 hours of footage. Then she saw it. A black SUV, parked a block away. It had been there for hours. Evelyn's pulse quickened. They weren't just watching her. They were waiting. She clicked into another feed, one set up near her office downtown. The same SUV. They weren't just waiting. They were following her. 12:15 a.m., the only call she could make. Evelyn picked up her phone and dialed the one number she hadn't planned to call. It rang twice before a groggy voice answered. "Do you have any idea what time it is?" "Kevin, I need you to listen carefully." The sleepiness vanished from his voice. Kevin Cross was an investigative journalist, the man who had helped her uncover the corruption in Crestwood. And right now, he was the only person she could trust. "What happened?" he asked immediately. "I'm being watched. Followed. Someone wants me out of this case. Permanently." Kevin was silent for a beat. Then, "Where are you?" "Safe for now. But I don't know for how long." She could hear the sound of rustling on his end, the unmistakable click of a laptop opening. "Tell me what you need." Evelyn exhaled. "I need a name. Someone powerful enough to orchestrate all of this, but hidden enough to have stayed out of the investigation so far." Kevin typed rapidly. "You think it's someone inside the department?" "No." She shook her head. "Someone above it." More typing. A long pause. Then Kevin let out a slow breath. "You're not going to like this." Evelyn felt her stomach tighten. "Tell me." Kevin hesitated. Judge Whitaker wasn't the one pulling the strings. He was just a piece of it. Evelyn closed her eyes. "Of course." "Then who?" Kevin's voice dropped. "The mayor." Silence. Evelyn sat down slowly, her mind spinning. Mayor Richard Calloway. He had always presented himself as a champion of law and order. But he had also been the most vocal opponent of federal intervention in Crestwood's affairs. He had fought against her appointment. He had defended Marston. He had publicly attacked every investigation into the department. Because he wasn't just defending them. He was part of it. "Evelyn," Kevin said, his voice serious. "If the mayor is behind this, you need to be careful. He has power, resources." A sudden crash sounded from the other side of the apartment. Evelyn's blood ran cold. Someone had just broken in. 12:45 a.m. A race against time. Evelyn's training took over. She moved fast, killing the lights in the apartment and grabbing the gun from her desk. She pressed her back against the wall, listening. Footsteps. Slow. Controlled. They knew she was here. They weren't here to steal anything. They were here for her. She took a deep breath, forcing her heartbeat to slow. "Think, Evelyn. Think." The nearest exit was the fire escape, but she had no way of knowing if they had someone watching it. The front door was locked, but not for long. Then she heard it, the faint click of a suppressor being attached to a gun. Whoever they weren't planning to leave her alive. Evelyn moved quickly. She grabbed a chair and hurled it through the window, shattering glass as it crashed onto the fire escape. The sound was deafening in the silent room. The footsteps rushed toward her. She pivoted, firing once, twice. A muffled grunt, a body hitting the floor. But she wasn't alone. More footsteps pounded toward her from the hall. No time. She ran. Ducking into the kitchen, she grabbed the only thing she could, a pot of boiling water left on the stove from earlier. As the second intruder burst in, she swung it hard, scalding liquid splashing across his face. He screamed, dropping his weapon. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed it and slammed the butt of the gun against his temple. He went down, breathing hard. Evelyn turned, her body still wired for another fight. Silence. It was over. For now. 1:30 a.m. The call that changed everything. Evelyn sat in the front seat of her car, parked in a secluded lot outside of town. Her hand still trembled slightly from the adrenaline. Her phone rang again. Kevin. She answered. Tell me you have something. Kevin's voice was strained. I have a lot, but you're not going to like it. Evelyn closed her eyes. Just say it. A beat of silence. Then, the mayor put a hit out on you. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. It's official. Contracts, money transfers, encrypted messages. I found everything. He wants you gone before you can take this to the next level. Her mind raced. If Calloway was this desperate, that meant she was close. Too close. Then we take this to the next level now, she said, her voice cold. Kevin hesitated. What are you going to do? Evelyn's grip on the steering wheel tightened. I'm going to end this. The city of Crestwood had never felt more suffocating. Evelyn Carter sat behind the wheel of her car, parked on a deserted stretch of road outside city limits. The weight of Kevin's words still pressed against her chest. The mayor put a hit out on you. She had spent years prosecuting criminals, dismantling corrupt networks, and exposing those who abused power. But she had never been the target. Until now. She took a steadying breath and dialed Kevin's number. Tell me everything, she said, gripping the steering wheel. Kevin's voice was urgent. I traced the payments. Calloway funneled money through 2 different shell corporations. One is tied to the police union, the same one Marston worked with. But the second? That's where it gets worse. How bad? It's connected to private security contractors. Mercenaries. Evelyn closed her eyes. Not just hired thugs. Professionals. Kevin continued, his voice growing graver. They're not just looking to scare you off, Evelyn. They want you gone for good. She exhaled sharply. Then I don't have time to play defense. Kevin hesitated. What are you planning? Evelyn's eyes darkened. I'm going after Calloway. 3:45 a.m. The mayor's mansion. Mayor Richard Calloway's estate sat on the edge of Crestwood, nestled behind 10-foot walls and a wrought iron gate. The kind of fortress built by men who feared the consequences of their own actions. Evelyn stood in the shadows across the street, watching the entrance. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter, hired security, not local law enforcement. They were expecting trouble. She had left her car 2 blocks away, keeping a low profile as she scoped out the defenses. She needed to get inside. Then, a stroke of luck. A delivery truck approached the gate. The driver flashed credentials, exchanged a few words with the guard, and was waved through. Evelyn moved fast. She sprinted across the street, staying low, slipping behind the truck just as the gate swung shut. She was inside. 4 a.m. The confrontation. The mansion was quiet, the air thick with tension. Evelyn moved carefully, avoiding the security cameras, slipping into the shadows where the patrols wouldn't see her. She had studied Calloway's routines. He always started his day early. She found him in his study. Mayor Calloway sat behind an oak desk, his back to the door, sipping from crystal glass. He hadn't noticed her yet. Evelyn stepped forward. You've been busy, Mr. Mayor. Calloway stiffened. Slowly, he turned, his sharp blue eyes widening for just a second before settling into a cold smirk. Evelyn Carter, he said smoothly, setting down his glass. I was beginning to think you wouldn't make it this far. Evelyn remained still. You ordered a hit on a federal prosecutor. That's bold, even for you. Calloway chuckled, leaning back in his chair. You think this is about you? You were a problem the moment you stepped into my city. Evelyn's fingers twitched at her side. Your city, Calloway's smirk deepened. Of course. Crestwood has thrived under my leadership. And for years, I made sure the right people were in power, people who understood how things worked. He gestured toward her. Then you showed up, and suddenly, my officers were in chains. My judges exposed. And now you threaten to burn everything I built. Evelyn stepped closer. Everything you built is a lie, and you're going to pay for it. Calloway shook his head. No, Evelyn, you still don't get it. He reached into his desk drawer. Evelyn tensed, but instead of a gun, he pulled out a folder. He tossed it onto the desk. "Do you know what that is?" he asked. Evelyn picked it up and flipped it open. She froze. Inside were surveillance photos of her. Pictures of her leaving court, walking into her apartment, sitting in her car. Some were taken just hours ago. Her stomach turned. They had been tracking her every move. Calloway's voice was almost gentle. "If I wanted you dead, Evelyn, you wouldn't have made it past my front gate." She met his gaze, fire burning in her veins. "Then why am I still here?" Calloway leaned forward, clasping his hands together. "Because I'm giving you a choice. You can leave. Drop this case, disappear, and never set foot in Crestwood again." His smile darkened. "Or you can stay, and I'll make sure you don't live long enough to regret it." Evelyn inhaled slowly, forcing herself to stay calm. "You're a desperate man, Mr. Mayor, and desperate men make mistakes." Calloway's smirk faltered just a bit. Evelyn reached in her coat pocket and pulled out a small, black device. She held it up between two fingers. A recording device. Calloway's face twisted with rage. "You..." Evelyn pressed a button, and his voice echoed back to him. "You were a problem the moment you stepped into my city. I made sure the right people were in power. Now you threaten to burn everything I built." Evelyn let it play for another second before shutting it off. She smiled. "That's the thing about desperate men, Mr. Mayor. They talk too much." Calloway shot to his feet. "You think you can take me down with that?" he snarled. "I own this city. You have nothing." Evelyn's smile widened. "That's where you're wrong." Her phone vibrated in her pocket. She pulled it out and turned the screen toward him. A live video feed. A press conference. Kevin Cross stood at a podium, reporters packed in tight, cameras flashing. He was reading from a document. Her document. "We have uncovered evidence directly linking Mayor Richard Calloway to bribery, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice." Calloway's face drained of color. It was already happening. Evelyn tucked the recording device back in her pocket. "By sunrise, you won't own anything." For the first time, real panic flashed across Calloway's face. He opened his mouth to threaten, to beg, to lie, but the moment was gone. Outside, sirens wailed. Evelyn glanced toward the window. "FBI." She turned back to Calloway, stepping around the desk, lowering her voice. "Your days of making the rules are over, Mr. Mayor." Heavy footsteps thundered through the hallway. The front doors burst open. And for the second time in 24 hours, Crestwood watched as a powerful man was led away in handcuffs. Evelyn followed them outside, standing tall as reporters swarmed. She had done it. She had won. But even as the cameras flashed, as the city erupted in celebration, she knew justice was never the end. It was only the beginning. The sun was rising over Crestwood, casting golden light across the city skyline. For the first time in years, the city felt different. Something had shifted. The old power structures, the ones that had kept corruption alive, that had protected the guilty and punished the innocent, were crumbling. Evelyn Carter stood outside the federal courthouse, watching as Mayor Richard Calloway was loaded into the back of a black SUV. His face was pale, his shoulders slumped. He wasn't smirking anymore. The cameras flashed wildly. Reporters shouted questions, their voices a blur of noise. But Evelyn barely heard them. She had spent years chasing justice, fighting battles that seemed impossible to win. And now, standing here, she should have felt victorious. But all she felt was exhaustion. A familiar voice broke through the chaos. "I'll be honest, I wasn't sure you'd live to see this." Evelyn turned to find Kevin Cross standing beside her, hands in his pockets, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "Not exactly the most comforting thing to say," she muttered. Kevin shrugged. "You wanted the truth." Evelyn exhaled, shaking her head. "You're lucky I don't charge you for emotional damage." Kevin chuckled, then turned serious. "You did it, Evelyn. You took down Calloway, Whitaker, Marston. You changed everything." Evelyn's smile was small. "For now." Kevin studied her. "You don't think this is over?" Evelyn looked out at the city. The streets, the people, the system. "Justice is never over, Kevin. It's a fight you have to keep winning." Kevin nodded slowly, understanding. "So what happens now?" Evelyn glanced down at her phone, where a new message had appeared. New case. New city. New corruption. She sighed. Now, she turned back to Kevin. I'll move on to the next battle. The fallout was swift and merciless. Every officer tied to Marston's corruption was either arrested, fired, or forced into early retirement. The department was placed under federal oversight, and a new interim chief was assigned, one who wasn't afraid to rebuild from the ground up. The people of Crestwood, once afraid to speak out, were stepping forward. More witnesses, more stories, more demands for accountability. The city was changing, slowly, but surely. Later that evening, Evelyn found herself standing outside a quiet diner on the edge of town. She wasn't sure why she had come. Maybe it was nostalgia. Maybe it was closure. She stepped inside, the scent of fresh coffee and grilled food wrapping around her. The place was nearly empty, except for a single figure sitting in the back booth. Chief Randall Pfeiffer. His uniform was gone. His badge, taken from him hours after Calloway's arrest. He looked up as she approached, a flicker of something in his eyes. Resentment? Regret? Relief? Evelyn slid into the booth across from him. You made the right choice. Pfeiffer snorted. Did I? Because it sure as hell doesn't feel like it. Evelyn studied him. He looked smaller than before, like a man who had carried too much weight for too long. You cooperated, she said. You gave us everything we needed. That means something. Pfeiffer leaned back, running a hand down his face. I spent my whole career convincing myself I was doing the best I could. That looking the other way wasn't the same as being guilty. But in the end, he allowed a hollow laugh. I was just as dirty as the rest of them. Evelyn met his gaze. You were. But you changed that. Pfeiffer shook his head. And now what? I lose my job, my reputation, everything I built. Evelyn leaned forward. You still have a choice, Pfeiffer. You can disappear. Pretend none of this happened. Or you could do something with what's left. Pfeiffer stared at her, then exhaled. And what exactly do you suggest? Evelyn gave him a knowing smile. You're good at running things. The city's going to need people who actually care about fixing what's broken. Maybe it's time you start doing the job for real. Pfeiffer scoffed. You want me to clean up the mess I helped make? Evelyn shrugged. I want you to prove that it's possible. Pfeiffer let out a deep breath. He didn't answer right away, but Evelyn saw something shift in his expression. Hope. By the next morning, Evelyn was gone. She had packed light. Just a suitcase, a laptop, and a few case files. She wasn't staying in Crestwood. She never did. As she drove past the courthouse one last time, she allowed herself a small smile. The city wasn't perfect. It never would be, but it was better than when she had arrived. That was enough. For now. Her phone buzzed again. She glanced at the screen. Unknown number. She smirked. Not this time. She let the call go to voicemail and pressed down on the gas, the city disappearing in her rearview mirror. Because justice never rested. And neither did she.